The snow had been falling since before dawn. It came down in thick, heavy curtains across the Montana plains, the kind of snow that didn't just cover the earth, but seemed to erase it, burying fence lines, swallowing roads, turning the world into one long, unbroken stretch of white silence. The sky above was the color of cold iron. The wind moved low across the ground, picking up loose powder and sending it spiraling in slow, ghostly ribbons between the bare cottonwood trees. There was no sound out there, not a bird, not a branch moving, just the snow falling and falling, as if the world itself had decided to go quiet out of respect for something that had not yet happened. Daniel Carter had been out since first light, checking his cattle, his breath rising in clouds around his face, his boots breaking through the crusted top layer of snow with every step. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades working land that never made anything easy. His hands were thick and scarred. His eyes, pale blue and steady, had seen drought and flood and fire and the slow, grinding kind of loss that comes from simply living long enough. He wasn't a man who talked much. He never had been. But he noticed things. He always noticed things. It was that quality, that quiet, watchful attention, that made him stop. He was crossing the low ridge that ran along the western edge of his property, the one that looked down over the old Miller Road, and beyond it the small community cemetery that had stood at the edge of town for over 100 years. Most days he didn't glance at it, but something made him look that morning. Maybe it was the movement, a small, dark shape against all that white, moving in a way that seemed wrong, too desperate, too alone. He stood still for a moment, squinting through the falling snow. Then he began walking toward it. As he came closer, descending the ridge with careful steps, the shape became a woman. She was on her knees in the snow beside one of the cemetery plots, and she was digging, not with a proper shovel, with a short-handled garden spade, the kind meant for flower beds and soft summer earth. She was driving it into the frozen ground with both hands, leaning her whole body into it, and the ground was barely yielding. The earth in January in Montana is not earth at all. It is iron. It is stone dressed up as soil, and she was trying to break through it alone. Daniel stopped walking when he was close enough to see what was beside her. A small wooden box, handmade, no bigger than a child's blanket chest. He removed his hat. He stood there for just a moment, the snow falling around him, and he understood everything without needing to be told a single word. The understanding moved through him like cold water, sudden, total, and devastating. He walked to her. She didn't look up, her breathing in ragged, silent pulls, her dark hair loose and wet against her face, her coat soaked through at the knees where she had been kneeling in the snow. Her hands around the spade were shaking, from cold or grief or both. It was impossible to say. She drove the blade into the ground again. It struck the frozen surface and skipped sideways, and she made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a breath. Something in between, something that had no name. Daniel crouched down beside her, reached into the snow and picked up the larger spade he had been carrying over his shoulder. Without a word, without a single question, he pressed the blade into the earth beside hers and pushed down with the full weight of his boot. She looked up then. Her face, God, her face. She was perhaps 35, though grief had written something older into the lines around her eyes. Her name, he would learn later, was Sarah Whitaker. She had come to Montana 2 years ago with her husband, who had left 8 months after that, and she had been raising her little boy alone out on the Dunmore property, 3 miles east of town. The boy's name was Eli. He had just turned 4 years old the week before. She had baked him a small cake with white frosting and put a single candle in it, and he had blown it out laughing, his cheeks round and flushed, his dark eyes bright with the particular joy that belongs only to children who do not yet know what the world can take from you. He had gone to sleep 2 nights ago with his boots still on the floor beside his bed and his stuffed rabbit tucked under his arm, and he had not woken up. The doctor in town was snowed in. There was no one to call. There was no one to come. And so she had built the box herself, with her own hands, through the night, in a cabin that had gone completely silent. She looked at Daniel with eyes that were beyond tears, beyond words, beyond almost anything recognizable as ordinary human expression. And he looked back at her, steady and quiet, and said nothing. He simply turned back to the ground and kept digging. That was all. That was everything. He had been working for perhaps 10 minutes when he heard the crunch of boots behind him. He didn't turn around. He knew the sound. His 2 ranch hands, Miguel and old Pete Harmon, who had seen him walking down from the ridge and followed at a distance the way men do when they sense something without being able to name it. They came up beside him, looked down at the box, looked at the woman, looked at each other. Neither of them spoke. Miguel picked up a flat-edged rock from the fence line and began working at the frozen perimeter. Pete pulled a folding shovel from his coat. He always carried one in winter out of pure old habit, and joined without ceremony. 4 people, no words, just the sound of metal against frozen earth and the wind and the snow coming down. It took nearly an hour. When the grave was deep enough, Daniel stepped back and stood with his hat in both hands. Miguel and Pete did the same. Sarah knelt in the snow beside the small wooden box and placed both palms flat against its surface. She stayed like that for a long time, long enough for the snow to settle on her shoulders, long enough for the cold to cease to matter. Long enough to say everything she would never be able to say out loud. She thought of the morning Eli had climbed into her bed before sunrise and pressed his cold little nose against her cheek just to make her laugh. She thought of the way he said her name, not Mama in the formal way, but a soft, quick sound, like a question and an answer at the same time. She thought of his boots by the bed. She thought of the rabbit. Then, with a gentleness that was almost impossible to witness, she lifted the box herself. She would not let anyone help her. This part was hers alone. She lowered her son into the ground. The sound she made then, low, broken, pulled from somewhere beneath language, was the kind of sound that stays with a person for the rest of their life. Daniel felt it move through his chest like a stone dropping into deep, still water. He looked at the sky. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a small, worn Bible. He had carried it since his mother gave it to him the morning he turned 18. The cover was soft from decades of handling, the pages thin and faintly yellowed. He opened it with stiff fingers to the 23rd Psalm and read aloud, his voice low and unhurried, each word dropped into the cold air like something carefully, deliberately placed. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Sarah had her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook without sound now. The kind of crying that has gone past noise into something interior and total. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. He closed the Bible. He did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. The words had been enough. Not to fix anything, nothing would fix this, but to give the moment the dignity it deserved. to tell a 4-year-old boy, somewhere beyond the gray sky and the falling snow, that he had not been put into the ground without prayer. The 4 of them stood in the snow above that small grave until the light began to shift. Then Daniel walked Sarah back to her cabin without asking if he wanted him to. She didn't resist. She walked beside him like someone moving through a dream, her steps automatic, her eyes somewhere far beyond the trees and the road and the cold Montana afternoon. Her cabin was small, and the fire had gone out. Daniel rebuilt it without being asked, stacking the wood near the door and coaxing the flame back to life while she sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup she had forgotten to fill. He filled it for her, put the kettle on, made sure the cabin was warm before he turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. "My name is Daniel Carter. My ranch is on the other side of the ridge. You are not far from neighbors." She looked at him. Her eyes, red and swollen, held something that was not quite gratitude and not quite recognition, something more fragile than either. Something that said simply, "I hear you." He nodded once and stepped out into the snow. He came back the next day with firewood. He stacked it against the side of the cabin without knocking, though she saw him through the window, his breath fogging in the cold air as he worked. He came the day after that with supplies from town, flour, coffee, canned goods, and left them on the porch without fanfare. The third day he knocked, and she opened the door, and he asked quietly if her livestock needed tending. She had 3 horses and a small number of cattle in the back pasture. She nodded without speaking, and he went and tended them without complaint. He did not push, he did not hover. He simply returned day after day, the way the sun returns, without fanfare, without demanding gratitude, without expecting anything at all in return. Slowly, something in the cabin began to change. Not the grief stayed. It would always stay, pressed into the walls of that small place the way cold presses into old wood, deep, permanent, familiar. But something else began to exist alongside it, something quieter than hope and warmer than habit. The cabin that had felt like the inside of a held breath began, almost imperceptibly, to feel like a place where someone still lived. One afternoon in late February, Daniel came by to fix a broken hinge on the barn door and found Sarah sitting on the porch steps despite the cold, a violin resting across her knees. She was not playing it, she was just holding it, turning it slightly in her hands, the way you hold something you are not yet sure you are allowed to have back. He recognized the look. He had seen it before, in the mirror, in the months after his sister died, when he would stand in the barn doorway at dusk and not go in, and not turn back, just stand there between one thing and the next. He sat down on the step below her without a word. He picked up the hinge and the screwdriver he had brought and turned them over in his hands. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that 2 people have to earn. After a long while, she drew the bow across the strings. Just one note, low and long and trembling faintly at its edges, like a question asked quietly into an empty room. Then she stopped. "I haven't played since before," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't have to play it," Daniel said, not looking up from the hinge. "Just holding it is something." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her eyes shifted, not dramatically, not the way healing arrives in stories where it comes all at once like sunshine after rain, but slightly, quietly, the way a door opens just an inch and a thin line of light falls through, and the room is still dark, but not entirely. The next week she played a full song. He heard it from inside the barn and stood still with one hand resting on a horse's neck and listened without moving until the last note faded. Then he went on with his work, and he did not mention it, and somehow that felt exactly right. March came. The snow began pulling back from the south-facing slopes. The light stayed a little longer each evening. One afternoon when Daniel arrived, Sarah had coffee already waiting on the table and a loaf of bread she had made that morning. Simple and dense, the kind made by hand without a recipe, just feel and patience and the quiet act of caring for someone without knowing exactly what else to do. She set it on the table between them, and they sat across from each other and ate and watched the light move across the window. "My sister died when I was 26, Daniel said after a while, not looking at her, his voice low and even. Fever. It came fast. She was 22. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. For a long time after, I didn't know what to do with myself, like I had lost the part of the day that made sense." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Outside, a single bird called once from somewhere in the tree line, the first bird either of them had heard in months. "That's exactly it," she said softly, "the part of the day that made sense." He nodded. They didn't say anything more about it, but something had passed between them, something real and mutual and quietly irreversible. Two people who had each carried their grief alone, sitting at a kitchen table in the early thaw, not trying to lift the weight from each other, but simply saying, "I see yours, and you see mine, and neither of us has to pretend it isn't there." It was, in its own quiet way, the most honest moment either of them had known in years. The blizzard came in the second week of April, unexpected and vicious, the way spring storms in Montana often are, arriving without warning and dropping 2 feet of snow in 18 hours. Daniel was already at Sarah's property when the sky turned, having come to repair a section of fence. When the wind picked up and the temperature dropped and the first wall of white came rolling across the plain, they looked at each other and understood without discussion that there was no going back to his ranch tonight. They spent the next 6 hours moving her cattle into the barn together, breaking through drifts, calling to each other through the howling wind, working with the easy, wordless efficiency of two people who have learned each other's rhythms without ever consciously trying. When the last animal was secured and the heavy barn doors were pulled shut against the screaming wind, they stood together in the lantern light, both breathing hard, both covered in snow, the golden light warm around them. And Sarah laughed. It was short and surprised and entirely unplanned, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can stop it, before you remember you weren't supposed to feel anything good yet. She put her mouth over her yawn almost immediately, as if catching herself, but it had already happened. It was already real. Daniel looked at her, and the lines around his eyes deepened, and he smiled, wide and warm and completely unguarded, the kind of smile that belongs to a man who has waited a long time to see something, and is quietly, deeply glad he stayed long enough to see it. "First time I've heard that," he said. She lowered her hand. "First time I've had a reason," she said softly. They went back to the cabin, and she made soup from what she had, and they sat by the fire while the storm threw itself against the walls outside, howling and relentless and entirely unable to reach them. The cabin that had once felt like the hollow inside of a grief too large to hold now felt warm and close and inhabited. Not fixed, not healed in any final way, but alive, genuinely, quietly alive. Eli's rabbit still sat on the small shelf above the fireplace, exactly where Sarah had placed it the morning after. It would always be there. Some things are not moved, some things are not supposed to be. But beside it now, almost without either of them noticing when it happened, there was a second coffee cup that had begun to belong to Daniel, left from one visit, never quite put away, staying where it had landed as if it had decided on its own to remain. 2 cups on a shelf, a fire burning steady, snow against the windows, and warmth inside. Grief does not leave. Anyone who tells you otherwise has not truly known it. It stays in the room with you, quiet in the corners, patient and permanent, present in the boots still beside the bed and the rabbit on the shelf, and the part of every day that will always feel slightly unfinished. But life is persistent too. It returns through the smallest openings, through a neighbor who shows up without being called, through firewood carried without thanks, and a fire rebuilt in a cold and empty cabin, through coffee on a table and bread made by hand, and a laugh caught off guard in a lantern-lit barn while the snow comes down outside. Through the simple, stubborn, extraordinary act of one human being deciding to stay beside another when everything in the world suggests there is nothing left worth staying for. That is what Daniel Carter understood, standing knee-deep in frozen Montana earth with a shovel in his hands and no words to offer and no way to make any of it better. Sometimes love does not announce itself with anything grand. Sometimes it just picks up a shovel and begins to dig. And sometimes, if you are patient enough and steady enough and willing to simply keep returning, that is more than enough to bring someone slowly, gently, faithfully back to life. If this story reached something quiet inside you, if it settled somewhere real, please subscribe to Desert Heart. This is what we do here. We tell the stories that don't shout, the ones that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that even in the coldest and longest seasons, warmth finds its way back in. Leave a comment below and tell us what moment stayed with you. We read every single one, and every word you write means something to us. This story carries meaning that reaches far beyond its emotion. It teaches that grief has no timeline and must never be rushed, minimized, or explained away. It shows what genuine human compassion looks like in its purest form, not in speeches or grand gestures, but in a man who picks up a shovel and asks no questions. It honors the deep culture of rural American life, the rancher, the isolated homestead, the community that shows up without being summoned, the faith that offers comfort without demanding answers. It reflects an important psychological truth that healing does not come from forgetting, but from finding safe and steady presence alongside loss. It demonstrates what healthy emotional strength looks like in a man. Someone who expresses care through consistent action, who reads scripture without apology, who builds trust through quiet faithfulness rather than charm or performance. It reminds every viewer of every age that no human being should carry their heaviest moments entirely alone. And it leaves behind one idea that is simple and true and worth remembering long after the story ends. That sometimes the most sacred gift one person can offer another is not advice, not answers, and not rescue. It is simply this: showing up, staying, returning, again and again and again, for as long as it takes.